Hey guys, and today I want to talk to you about immersion, and how I personally believe that immersive games are games that allow players to make meaningful choices. For starters, how do we define a meaningful choice? A choice is a decision that is picked out from numerous options, or a single alternative option. A meaningful choice is a weighted decision that has a massive effect on the outcome of a game. Meaningful choices are very difficult to design, especially when balancing is considered, and as such it is difficult to make a truly immersive game. When done right, however, the player's agency can have catastrophic effects on the game's experience, which makes players feel like they are in control, and when players are in control, they feel immersed. When you limit the player's control over a game, the relationship between the player and the game becomes distant. Thus, the player doesn't get immersed into it very easily. To be immersive, games need to let players pull the strings. The problem is that the more control the player is given, the more branches are needed. This takes work. In addition, if you are making a narrative-focused game, giving players too much control can be detrimental to the experience, as a narrative is supposed to be a form of expression. If the player pulls the strings, you are essentially allowing the players to make the expression, rather than the narrative, and thus narrative and immersion begins to clash. Now, I want to make it clear that neither immersion or narrative are necessary in games, and that they merely serve as a way to enhance an experience, not to build a framework. In my Nier Automata review, I mentioned that the design of video games is equivalent to that of a tree's anatomy. Unlike trees, however, video games do not require branches, nor do they require leaves. They merely require roots and a trunk to function. These are the frameworks that make a working game. It is important to design a working framework before experimenting with enhancements, and as such I do not recommend considering immersive or narrative game design until you have constructed a solid framework. So once you have the framework in place and all of the necessary components, it's time to enhance the game with either narrative or immersion. In this video I will focus primarily on immersion. Now, we have already gathered that immersion requires meaningful choices, but how does one construct a meaningful choice? First, we need a weight to our choices. To do that, we need harsh consequences for our choices, and we also need the player to be greatly rewarded for consistently making the correct choice. The weight affects everything. Usually the most weighted choices are the better ones. A lot of people would associate the term risk and reward with weighted choices, and they wouldn't be wrong. Games like F-Zero do this with its boost system, that drains your health in order to increase your vehicle's speed. This allows players to immerse themselves in a state which many like to call in the zone. This is merely one method of immersing players, and while I wouldn't say that this method of building immersion is strong, it's enough to get the player to feel like they're in the zone. So how do we make the immersion stronger? That's simple, adding more choices for the player to make. To truly immerse the player, it is usually a good idea to overwhelm players with meaningful choices. Out of all the games I've played in my life, no game has come close to achieving this as well as Blade Warband. Blade Warband is hands down the most immersive game I have ever played, because every second the player is constantly bombarded with choices and dilemmas that they are required to navigate through. So much so that the experience feels real. Immersion is not about realistic aesthetics or mechanics. Immersion is about choice. No matter how realistic a game looks or plays, if a game limits the player's choice, the game fails to immerse the player. As such, making a game look realistic and adding needless elements of realism adds nothing to the game, and can actually be detrimental to the experience, as certain elements of realism can be disengaging to the player, as it can be tedious. Players play video games to escape the monotony of real life. The choices in games are a way of making players feel as if they are able to make impactful decisions while bypassing the monotony of real life, because decision making is real. Nobody can control your decisions, only you have the power to make them. This goes for real life too. We all have the power to make decisions and deal with consequences in real life, so why can't we do the same in games too? This is where games can truly become realistic, as they implement the real elements of choice, which makes players feel like the experience is totally real, as the choices they are making are constantly impacting the state of the game. This is the nature of Blade Warband, and why I consider it to be the best Western RPG I've ever played, because to me, immersion is what sets Western RPGs apart from Japanese RPGs, as I find that Western RPGs tend to do this far better than Japanese RPGs, and I believe that Western developers need to focus on their strengths rather than their weaknesses, and create truly immersive experiences with lots of meaningful choices. Of course, I personally prefer Japanese RPGs over Western RPGs, but Japanese RPGs do not immerse me. Rather, they allow me to explore a distant universe in which I have little control or connection with. This may sound crazy to some, as narrative is all about connectivity. You must understand, however, that I prioritize exploration over narrative, and that is why I personally enjoy Japanese RPGs, for completely different reasons to most. The truth is that both narrative and immersion allow players to feel attached to a game. They merely use completely different methods in order to do so. Now, before I wrap this up, I'm going to give you an example of a meaningful choice. You encounter a man who is about to be executed. You know for certain that the man is innocent, but you also know for certain that the people performing the execution are very powerful. Would you risk yourself to save this man? Now, on the surface, this decision doesn't seem meaningful in the game. It does, however, seem meaningful in a real-life situation because it is a matter of life and death. So how can we make this situation more meaningful? One example is to reward players who save the man with extra quests, which upon completion allows players to recruit the man as a companion. By now the choice seems obvious. You clearly want to rescue the man because so far the positive outcome outweighs the negative outcome. This is where consequence comes into play. To have a truly meaningful choice, rewards and consequences must be balanced. If you want to be extremely brutal, you could give the game permadeath, in which dying causes the player to have to restart the entire game from the beginning. Whether or not you would be willing to do this depends on the length of your game. Alternatively, if you want to be less harsh, making the wrong choice would cause you to be imprisoned and tortured, in which you lose all of your items and you will become wounded and scarred, which causes you to permanently lose stats. Now, it's important to note that players may try to save scum their way through choices. Mountain Blade negates this with its realistic mode. Okay, so it doesn't do this completely, as you can simply Alt-Tab and shut down with the task manager before an autosave, or reload a backup if you really wanted to, but the game is intended to make punishments permanent. Perhaps there's a way of improving on what Mountain Blade set out to do. You just need to find a way to autosave after every single choice, and if you want permadeath you need to add temporary saves, in which when players load up the save gets deleted until they quit the game, in which the game is automatically saved again, so that players can reload. I personally recommend that games allow players to carry stuff over from previous failed playthroughs. That way they feel like each failure is part of the journey, and that it is on their record. That way, when the players start again, even if they make the right choices the second time around, their previous mistakes will still be recorded. Always keep a record of these choices, as it makes the player care more about these choices. It is a way for players to identify with their experiences and reflect on their mistakes. That way, the journey continues, and thus, the immersion never dies. I hope this has been an interesting video for you guys, and I'll see you all next time.